Let me see here. I appreciate your knowledge on the history of our English lineage. I checked my last name, which is Monger. My last name was of Welsh lineage. I was totally shocked. You got to do a history lesson on the Black Plague. There's limited resources on what truly happened around this time period. Thanks. Yeah, brother, I will as soon as possible. You brothers have to understand something about the so-called Black Plague. History is about narrative. It's not about truth. I've stated this in the past. Okay, it's about narrative. It's not about truth. They don't want you to know that so-called blacks ruled in Europe for over 1,000 years over the so-called Caucasian. Okay, that would have a massive effect on the overall psychological outlook of both nations of people. It will cause all types of turmoil and upheaval. A lot of blacks have invested a lot of mental energy in the victimization role, right? White people owe us this. White people owe us that. They had us in slavery for 400 years, and so-called blacks have invested a lot of energy into that victim mentality. All right. And so-called whites have been taught for years, for most of their whole life, that they were always rulers and that they've civilized the entire world and yada, yada, yada. They've been taught these things. All right. So this type of information about blacks ruling in the Middle Ages, that type of stuff, they can't let that stuff out. All right. They just can't. I mean, you look at it, for example, you look at the Bible. And it's always funny. People always say the Bible is the white man's book. The Bible states explicitly that the ancient Egyptians were of the descendants of Ham. The Caucasian man says that so-called black people come from Ham. That's what he says, right? But then he'll make movies showing ancient Egyptians as Caucasian. You understand that? That's what he does. This is after he's already said that he believes in the Bible, and the Bible explicitly says that the that the ancient Egyptians were the sons of Ham. But he'll make a movie showing the ancient Egyptians as Caucasian. Why is that? Because the ancient Egyptians had a culture that he venerates, that he worships, that he predicates his own society off of. Anything of value, he's going to try to make Caucasian because it has a great psychological effect, not only on him, on himself and his progeny and his how he views himself. It also has an effect on every other race. All right. But yes, most of you so-called black people have Welsh last names. The Welsh were people of color, so-called the original Welsh. All right. So-called black people. Same thing with the British, Irish, so-called Scottish, so-called Germans, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, etc. All right. Italians, Spanish, Portuguese, so on and so forth. But, I'll do a video on that later. So-called Black Plague, that was a disease that was brought by the so-called white man out of the caves of Europe, out of the caves of Central Asia, I should say. As they pushed westward, they brought that disease with them. That's why it came about around the time of the Renaissance. All right. They call it the Black Plague because it affected mostly blacks. All right. You will not see any real information stating the truth about the so-called Black Plague. They'll claim that rats brought it. The disease moved way too fast for it to have been brought by rats. All right. So that's just bullshit that they made up. Let me see. Let's see here. Judah, what you said about dreams and misery loves company is exactly what I'm going through, man. Almost broke me down. Great video. Brother, don't let anybody break you down from following your dream. I'm telling you, they will try to do it. All right? As long as what you want to do is not hurting anybody else, you go ahead and pursue your dream. All right? Most people don't have the courage to follow what they want to do with their life. Most people conform because most people are followers. Most people feel the pressure to want to fit into the conventions of society. That's why if you ever are in a corporate America workplace, there's 99% zombies there. All right. Most people don't know what they really think. They don't know what they really feel. That's why most people in this society are massively depressed. Okay? That's why the prescription drug industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. They like having the people depressed. All right? Everybody's trying to fit in. Most people don't have courage. All right? Once you figure out what you want to be in life, then that's a curse. A lot of people are here on the earth and don't know what they're here for. That's a curse. All right? If you know what you're here for, then you go and you pursue it. And don't let anybody take that shit away from you, man. That's all you have is your vision for yourself. All right? But yeah, I'll end the video with that. All right? Peace. All right, so, based off of some of the questions that I answered in the last video in regards to the last names, I'm going to add this little section here at the end of the video just to validate some of the statements that I've made about the last names from the British Isles. All right. This is an article from theguardian.com. It's going to read Semantic Enigmas. Why do so many African Americans, so-called African Americans, have Welsh names? Venus Williams, Colin Powell, Floyd Patterson. Common thought relates the names to slave owners, but there were very few Welsh slave owners in the American South. Most Welsh immigrants to the U.S. ended up in the steel and coal industry in the North. Now, let's see what they say. You're going to have a series of Caucasians try to answer this question, and they're all going to flop because they've been taught the slave narrative, and they're going to do whatever they can to try to maintain the slave narrative. So let's see what they said. Given that seaports in South Wales were great shipping centers and handled much of the triangular trade, it is possible that slaves taken from Africa were named after sea captains or crew on the ships that transported them to America, or the names of the people who owned the vessels. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In the slave narrative, and this is how ridiculous a lot of these Caucasians are, because they're so desperate to protect the slave narrative. And I'm gonna hit you with some. A lot of you so-called black people are desperate to protect the slave narrative too, because it makes you feel close to the so-called white man. Right? But on this guy's planet, quote unquote slaves were taken from Africa. They were named after sea captains or crew on the ships. And they kept those names and remembered those names on the voyage over to America. And they said to their new masters, my name is after the sea captain of the damn ship. This is how ridiculous these people are. Let's go to the next one. In the Philadelphia region, there was a very large Welsh community that settled the area. And that legacy lives on in places such as Balasinwyd and Schuylkill. The towns that bear these old Welsh names are also the richest parts of the area to this day, and money, not geographic location, was the only qualification for slave ownership. It appears that the questioner is mistakenly under the impression that slavery was always limited to the agricultural South. I am sure that many of the names have thus originated from this area. So now, this guy is trying to say that tens of millions of so-called black people have Welsh last names because of a Welsh area in the Philadelphia region. All right, are you guys starting to understand how desperate and how stupid people become when they're trying to maintain a narrative? It's like somebody who's trying to prove that Santa Claus exists. All right, let's move on. 2 qualifications to the previous posters. Williams and Patterson are not exclusively Welsh names. Patterson is a fairly common Scottish name. You know why? Because the original Scottish were black. A large portion of African Americans have Scottish names. You see, even this woman notices it. See that? A large portion of African Americans have Scottish names, due partly to the fact that many Scots emigrated or were exiled, deported to the Carolinas after the 1745 uprising. And many of those who survived became slave owners a generation or so later and gave their names to their slaves. So now this person is trying to make you believe that these Scottish who came over here, and I'm gonna hit you with some. Many of the Scottish who came in from Scotland were black Scots. All right, if you ever look up the origin of fried chicken, it tells you that fried chicken came from Scotland. All right, and that's because a lot of the so-called people who came from Scotland were so-called black. All right, but this woman wants you to believe that white Scottish people came over here and bought up a lot of the slaves, so-called black slaves. All right. Incidentally, in doing so, they were merely passing on the Highland Scottish custom by which all the members of a clan took their surname from the clan chief, whether or not they could trace any blood relation. Colin Powell was born in the U.S., but his parents came from the Caribbean, I believe Jamaica, to the U.S. Schuylkill is not Welsh at all, but Dutch. Yeah, and let me say this. A lot of the original Dutch were black, all right, so-called black, as are many place names in New York State and elsewhere in the mid-Atlantic region. Once again, this does nothing to explain why tens of millions of so-called blacks, not just in the Americas, but in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, have Welsh, Scottish, English, Dutch, German last names. Let me say this. Those of you who watch boxing, guys like Marvin Hagler, Adrian Broner, Bernard Hopkins, those names, Hagler, Hopkins, Broner, those are all German last names. Okay? The original Germans were so-called black people. For those of you who don't know, they're the ones who settled in England. Okay? Anyway, let's continue on. Adam Guzman. The only thing the slave traders and owners did to the last names of many of their slaves was strip them of it. That's about it. So you see, Adam Guzman's the only one on here talking a little bit of sense. He said the only thing the slave traders and owners did to the last names of many of their slaves was strip them of it. That's about it. May I make a suggestion here again? I don't think black people have the last names of slave owners. Doesn't make sense. Why would anyone want the last name of a family that caused them misery? Black people have the last names of heroes who were mostly Welsh and Norman. Right. The reason why so-called blacks have the last name of mostly Welsh and Norman was because most blacks have Welsh or Norman lineage. All right. The Normans who landed in England in 1066 AD under William the Conqueror, they were so-called black people. OK. Anyway, the Welsh were barely involved in slavery. See, Adam Guzman is the only one who's making a little sense. This is why I wanted to post this article, because a lot of you brothers and sisters need to read this to understand. These so-called white people, they think about these things. They're trying to figure out how come all these so-called blacks have these Welsh last names. You know why? Because most of these so-called white people, like the ones that you see in this article, they're white trash. They're the recipients. They're the recipients of the fake historical narrative. They don't know that the original Welsh were so-called black. All right. But let's find another article. All right. So now this is an article on the Daily Mail called "The Blackest Name in America. Why are 90% of Washingtons African Americans?" And this is something that I've mentioned in the past. It wouldn't surprise me if George Washington was actually a so-called black man. It wouldn't shock me at all. All right. I mean, he could have been a Caucasian. People think that because somebody was a slave owner, so-called slave owner, that makes them Caucasian. You have many so-called black slave owners. All right. Not saying that George Washington was definitely a so-called black man. I'm just saying it wouldn't shock me. All right. Almost every person I met in my life, last name Washington, was a so-called black man. All right. Because once again, those were so-called blacks that came here from England. Anyway, let's read this article written by a man named Jesse Washington, who's probably a so-called black man himself. It says George Washington's name is inseparable from America and not only from the nation's history. It identifies countless streets, buildings, mountains, bridges, monuments, cities, and people. In a puzzling twist, most of these people are black. The 2000 U.S. Census counted 163,036 people with the surname Washington. 90% of them were African American, a far higher black percentage than for any other common name. Famous surname, New Yorker Shannon Washington, who says, growing up, I just knew that only black people had my last name. Washington was listed 138th when the Census Bureau published a list of the 1,000 most common American surnames from the 2000 survey, along with ethnic data. The project was not repeated in 2010. Yeah, it probably wasn't repeated because they said, damn, we finding too many niggas with this name. Anyway, 90% of those Washingtons, numbering 146,520, were black. Only 5%, or 8,813, were white. 3% were two or more races, 1% were Hispanic, and 1% were Asian or Pacific Islander. No, they wasn't. Those were people who put down on the on the damn survey that they were Hispanic or Asian or Pacific Islander, but their father was most likely a so-called black man, and they just didn't want to claim it on the survey. Jefferson was the second blackest name at 75% African American. There were only 16,070 Lincolns, and that number was only 14% black. Jackson was 53% black. Williams was the 16th blackest name at 46%. But there were 1,534,042 total Williamses, including 716,704 black ones. So there were more blacks named Williams than anything else. That's my point. When you say that there was that out of their survey, that Williams was 46% black. You got to understand something. So-called blacks only represent, allegedly anyway, about 12% of the total population. All right. So these numbers are really skewed. All right. But anyway, just reading on. The name black was 68% white, meaning there were far more white blacks than black blacks. The name white, meanwhile, was 19% black. The story of how Washington became the blackest name begins with slavery and takes a sharp turn after the Civil War, when all blacks were allowed the dignity of a surname. That's the narrative. Even before emancipation, many enslaved black people chose their own surnames to establish their identities, or more likely, many so-called blacks already had their own last name because it was a family name that they carried with them over here from the British Isles. All right. Some historians theorize large numbers of blacks chose the name Washington in the process of asserting their freedom. Let's read that sentence again. Some historians theorize. Well, if you're a historian, why would you theorize? You're not a historian, you're a fabricator. A historian tells you what happened. A historian don't tell you what they think or what they believe might have happened. All right, to maintain a narrative. But anyway, today there are black Washingtons like this writer who are often identified as African American by people they have never met. This most likely is a fake portrait of George Washington. Wouldn't shock me at all. It says President Washington, he had over 100 slaves, but he ordered that they all be freed on the death of his wife. Yeah, well, so-called blacks own slaves too. Please understand that. There are white Washingtons who are sometimes misidentified and have felt discrimination. There are Washingtons of both races who view the name as a special, if complicated, gift. And there remains the presence of George Washington, born 279 years ago on February 22nd, whose complex relationship with slavery echoes in the blackness of his name today. His great-grandfather John arrived in Virginia from England in 1656. George married the daughter of a wealthy man and eventually owned more than 5,000 acres. Along with land, he inherited 10 human beings from his father. He gained more through his marriage to a wealthy widow and purchased still more enslaved blacks to work the lands he aggressively amassed. But over the decades, as he recognized slavery's contradiction with the freedoms of the new nation, Washington grew opposed to human bondage. Washington was not a harsh slave owner by the standards of the time. He provided good food and medical care. He recognized marriages and refused to sell off individual family members. Later in life, he resolved not to purchase any more black people. Now, a lot of this that's being written as narrative from the author. All right. A lot of this is written as narrative because this is another so-called black man who equates slavery with blacks and who equates the word slave with a so-called black person. All right. So just understand that this is a very mal-affected black person writing this article, and he's pushing a narrative. But he also worked his slaves quite hard and under difficult conditions. As president, he shuttled them between his Philadelphia residence and Virginia estate to evade a law that freed any slave residing in Pennsylvania for 6 months. While in Philadelphia, Oney Judge, Martha Washington's maid, moved about the city and met many free blacks. Upon learning Martha was planning one day to give her to an ill-tempered granddaughter, Judge disappeared. According to Ron Cherner's new biography, Washington a Life, the president abused his presidential powers and asked the Treasury Department to kidnap Judge from her new life in New Hampshire. The plot was unsuccessful. Mr. Chernow said Washington was leading the schizoid life. In theory and on paper, he was opposed to slavery, but he was still zealously tracking and seeking to recover his slaves who escaped. Let's skip down this article because this article looks a little long. Let's see here. It says only a handful of George Washington's hundreds of slaves did, for example, and he recorded most as having just a first name. It says Mary Thompson, an historian at Mount Vernon, said it's a myth that most enslaved blacks bore the last name of their owner. You see that? I'm going to read it again. Mary Thompson, an historian at Mount Vernon, said it's a myth that most enslaved blacks bore the last name of their owner. Only a handful of George Washington's hundreds of slaves did, for example, and he recorded most as having just a first name. Got a picture of Denzel there. Let me see here. All right, a lot of y'all can read this article for yourself. I'll probably read it a little later on. It looks a little long, but it just proves my point that a lot of these names, they make you think that these names come from slavery, and they really don't. Even though this article is still trying to push that narrative, that because he doesn't really know where the names come from. But the point being, like I said, a lot of these so-called black people, they brought these names over here with them. All right. All right. There's another page I found. Welsh surnames common among African Americans. I was asked this morning why so many African Americans have Welsh surnames. Quincy Jones, Jesse Owens, Venus Williams, Serena Williams. Was it due to slavery solely, or was there other reasons? It seems Welsh names predominate in the Afro-American community. I found this link below, but it would be interesting to see if SSIWers can offer any insight. All right, this is a forum called Forum Say Something. Some say something in. Yes, of course, you're going to get the normal nonsense. Yes, in the U.S., many slaves took on their owner's surname. Well, we just read that was a myth. So he says you also find a lot of Irish names among African Americans. Why is that? Because the so-called original Irish were black. That's why. Let's see here. Yeah, let's click on the link that he provided and see what we find here. And this is just to show you once again, these Caucasians, they get together and they talk about you black people, man. All right. They want to know why you have their names, because they've been the recipients of the slave narrative. All right. So why do Welsh names seem to be so common within the African American community? Some time ago, Mr. David Evans of Australia drew our attention to this topic with the following email. We're going to skip down a little bit. I've been trying to track down the reason for what I consider to be a preponderance of Welsh surnames among black Americans. I find it curious that again and again, among various subjects of interest to me, jazz and tennis, the names Williams, Evans, Jones, Thomas come up again and again. All right. Mr. Evans thus raised several interesting issues. If we accept the widely held notion that slaves tended to adopt the surnames of their masters, A high modern incidence of Welsh surnames would indicate that Welsh immigrants formed a large proportion of the slaveholder class. For reasons discussed below, I believe this concept to be quite wrong. In fact, it seems to me that the Welsh can be quite proud that their names survived to such an extent within the black population of America. My access to the literature has been largely limited to British sources. However, many American visitors to the Data Wells website have contributed their insights, advice, and encouragement. I hope that between us, we have managed to offer a balanced picture. No, I guarantee you that you won't, because y'all are Caucasians and y'all are trying to maintain a slave narrative. Let me see here. George F. Nagel of Pennsylvania has carried out valuable research on naming practices in his state. He writes, although it is true that slaves in the South did sometimes adopt the surname of the slaveholders or were assigned the name for tax or legal purposes, they almost never did so in the North. Prior to the 1780s, Northern slaves were almost always identified only by a given name. Beginning in the 1780s, as Pennsylvania began its long process of gradual emancipation, some slaves began to be identified with surnames as well as given names. I've collected data on more than 3,000 slaves in Pennsylvania and have found only one instance where the surname of the slave matches the surname of the slave holder. So please look at that. He checked over 3,000 so-called slaves, and only one of them had the same last name as the slaveholder. You see that? Y'all gonna learn today. Let's see. Let's read down. It says, I wonder if many people are aware that the name Floyd has a Welsh origin. This was originally a descriptive element in early Welsh names in the form Lloyd, meaning gray or sometimes brown. Let me read that again. This was originally a descriptive element in early Welsh names in the form Lloyd, meaning gray or sometimes brown. Medieval scribes not of Welsh origin had trouble spelling this, and it was often written as Lloyd or in an attempt to reproduce the singular L sound of Welsh as Floyd. This is a good article right here. This is a good article right here. Let me see here. Yeah, Ellis is another so-called very popular name that a lot of so-called blacks have that is a Welsh name. This person right here is trying to push the slavery narrative. My ancestors were Welsh and came to North America in the late 18th or very early 19th century and had migrated to Alabama by 1820. They were indeed slave owners, and in fact, many of the former slaves stayed long after emancipation. One of the former slaves that stayed with the family had the name of Ellis and was so loved and respected by the family that his name was given to my mother as her middle name, David J. Oh, so in other words, he's saying that his name was Ellis and that his last name was Ellis, but his family's last name wasn't Ellis. So he had his own last name as well. Yeah. All right. So you know what? Y'all can, it's going to list some Welsh surnames. Welsh surnames dominate any list of community names. Owens, Evans, Bowen, Jones, Thomas, Powell, Williams. The list is endless. You know, you brothers can read this article for yourself. The city of Montgomery has a population of over 200,000. There is a town called Pritchard and villages called Cardiff, Jones, Rehoboth, and Morris. Georgia has the counties of Evans, Montgomery, Jones, Floyd, Morgan, Thomas, Glenn, and Jenkins. As we know, those are all so-called black last names. You look at this. Yeah, this is a great article right here. But anyway, y'all got the point. Peace.